everyone, my name is Garvin and I read things and natter about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today we're going to launch a multi-month dive into the myth of Atlantis. So, all cards on the table here, as you might have figured out, I don't believe Atlantis was ever real. So I'm going to be engaging with this as a myth, a fictional story. That said, we are going to be looking at the real world impact of Atlantis and belief in it, which means in a month or so, things might get a little dark. But those videos will have a disclaimer, and this video should be safe for everyone. So let's start with ground zero, where the myth gets started, a dialogue by Plato. Plato is one of the more influential Greek philosophers and was a noted student of Socrates. In most of Plato's writings, he would have Socrates as the main figure, so much of what we know about Socrates comes from Plato. Now, there's a lot that's disputed about Plato's life, but it's widely believed that his real name was Aristocles, with Plato being a nickname that his wrestling coach gave him. We know that he came from a wealthy aristocratic family, and we know he wrestled, with some sources claiming that he appeared in 2 out of the 4 Pan-Hellenic games, the Isthmian games and Pythian games, if I'm pronouncing those correctly. And he did fairly well in both. So, in modern terms, he would have been at the level of someone who could wrestle at events like the Pan American or the Commonwealth Games. Not quite Olympic, but more than good enough to twist your average man into knots with his bare hands. Everything else about him is rather hazy. We even have conflicting traditions of how and where Plato died. So, kind of a man of mystery is Plato. Plato's most famous work is The Republic, which I won't discuss here, although my patrons did get a patron-only video where I talk about my many feelings about that work. The important thing to note here is that the Republic outlines Plato's ideal state, and this work, which is Timaeus and Critias, are sequels to that work. So let's dive into the details of what's in front of us here. This video is going to focus mainly on Critias, because that's the dialogue that discusses Atlantis, the whole reason we're here. Timaeus is the longer work out of the two, has the speaker to repay Socrates for outlining his ideal state, gives a long speech on the history of the universe. I say Socrates because that's who is actually in the story, just FYI. In it, Timaeus outlines the creation of the universe by a single creator, the physical makeup of the universe, and the creation of everything in it, including the gods and humanity. Now, to be honest with y'all, I didn't care for it. It was very meandering, and it got bogged down into very weird details, such as the nature of fire, water, air, and earth, and how these elements derive and intermix with each other. And it's very esoteric in a Greek, ancient Greek kind of sense. It doesn't really hold any context for me, so it just kind of whooshes over my head and makes my eyes glaze over. So didn't care for that part. Sorry for anyone who's a fan of it. I found Critias vastly more interesting. First, he talks about how he wishes to provide a story featuring Socrates' ideal state from the Republic, and he could totally do so using a totally true story that has been in his family for generations that no one has heard of until now for reasons. He states that he got his story from his great-grandfather, who heard it from Solon himself, who in turn heard it from an Egyptian priest in the Egyptian city of Sais. Now, as for who Solon is, I'll have a link to a video about him, but let's talk about Egypt here first. So why do they say Solon got this story from an Egyptian priest, you're asking? Well, the Greeks were very much aware that they were living on top of another civilization, Mycenaean Greece. that didn't make it through the Bronze Age collapse. The Greeks knew that this had happened, that they had lost everything that happened before, except for oral traditions like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and the various epics. They were aware that they had had writing before and they had lost it and had to reinvent the very concept of writing. And they felt that rather keenly at times. Meanwhile, they were aware that Egypt was this ancient society that had survived this, that Egypt had outlasted numerous other civilizations and not only preserved continuity, but a body of written work that would stretch back into time. Now, due to the practices of Egyptians pharaohs, that written work is not what I would call super reliable, but it existed and people could read it, which was more than the Greeks could say on their side. So they tended to turn to Egypt as the wellspring of ancient knowledge, and they really did prize that. So you would see a lot of Greeks going, well, this is an ancient Egyptian secret, sort of how we would call something an ancient Chinese secret to imply that it's really old and really wise. The same thing, really. Now, the Egyptian priest, who is never named in this work, has a conversation with Solon after Solon, at his request, outlines his family history, stating, "It's a shame that all Greeks are like children, and there is not an old man among you." Solon is very confused by this and asks what the hell he means, and the Egyptian tells Solon that he is the heir to a civilization, not just one, but several, that have repeatedly risen and fallen from cataclysms of fire and water. Cataclysms so thorough that scattered survivors have always lost the art of reading and writing, among others, and must start from square one, thus losing their culture and their history. So he basically tells Solon that the Greeks are a people with amnesia on a historical level. He states that Egypt is spared this fate and preserves the memories of what came before due to being shielded by the desert and the river Nile, without which Egypt would surely die. The priest says, however, he would be glad to share at least some of this lost history with Solon, because he reveals that the patron goddess of this city, Neith, is actually Athena herself, which makes Athens a sister city to this Egyptian city, and therefore part of the family. This story is how Athens, 9,000 years ago, was a virtuous civilization, respected and held in awe for the beauty and virtue of its people, and the 20,000 warriors who were unmatched and were able to fight back a larger, wealthier state that had given into depravity and lost its way. Well, Athens was able to do this in alliance with wise and noble Egypt, because no one does this kind of stuff on their own, of course. The story starts with the origins of both civilizations. We are told that the world was divided into parts by the gods, and each god got a district by drawing lots. Within each district, the god in question would act as a teacher and a shepherd to the people within it, leading by education and persuasion rather than by force. Atlantis was in the district of Poseidon. It was a small continent or large island, the size of Libya and Asia together. At this point on the screen, you should see a map of the world as they believed it was at the time, because what they called Asia is nowhere as big a landmass as what we call Asia. But this should give you an idea of the scale of Atlantis. Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, and in order to keep her secure and provide a rich and easy life for his new love, Poseidon turned to a bit of terraforming. The central part of the land of Atlantis was dominated by a single high mountain surrounded by a broad and rich plain. Around this, Poseidon creates a ring of seawater. This ring of seawater was enclosed by another ring of land, which was enclosed by another ring of seawater, which was enclosed by a larger ring of land, which was surrounded by the bloody ocean. In the center island, he creates two springs of fresh water, one that's always cold and one that's always hot. Then he settles down with his new girlfriend and fathers 10 sons with her in 5 sets of twins. Wow, and you thought you had it rough, right? 5 sets of twins. I don't envy that at all. The eldest son was named Atlas and was given the central island and basically made High King of Atlantis. Each of the others was given their own district within Atlantis and was made a governor of that district, being allowed to rule it however they saw fit as long as they followed the laws of Poseidon, which was basically back your brothers up and play nice with no fighting. Basic rules. This isn't all that different from how Greeks at the time described Egypt as being governed, I have to point out. Egypt was divided into districts called nomes, and each nomarch had a wide governing authority, often answerable only to the pharaoh of Egypt. Now, the rulers of Atlantis would also meet on the central island in the temple dedicated to Poseidon every 5 or 6 years in alternating periods. So if you meet once, then you meet the second time 5 years later, and then the third year 6 years after the second meeting, just to try and make that clear. So while they were there, they would get together, hunt down a bull, herds of which were allowed to roam free around the temple area using only rope and wooden implements. They would sacrifice the bull, review the law code that Poseidon had left for them transcribed on a column, like Egyptians were also known to do, and work out any disagreements among each other after having a feast. I should also note that the Persians at the time were governed in a similar way, dividing their empire into satraps, where the royal appointed satrap answered pretty much only to the emperor of Persia. So there's some weird echoes going on here, right? Now, Plato goes into an intense description of Atlantis here that most of the latter day works will pretty much ignore, which I find a little sad because it's very interesting and very detailed. It talks about how there are chestnuts that grow on this island, how there's a wide variety of fruits and other plants, and talks a bit about the native animals, including herds of elephants. What I also found interesting is that there are elements that are firmly Persian in character. Uh, to give you an example, let me read you a description of the walls of the Persian capital at the time by Herodotus. The largest of these walls is in size about equal to the circuit of the wall round Athens. And of the first circle, the battlements are white, of the second, black, of the third, crimson, of the fourth, blue, of the fifth, red. Thus are the battlements of all circles colored with various tints, and the last two have their battlements, one of them overlaid with silver, and the other with gold. I hope you will now indulge me and allow me to read you a description of the walls of Atlantis. The stone which was used in the work they quarried from underneath the center island, and from underneath the zones, on the outer as well as the inner side. One kind was white, another black, a third red. Skipping ahead a bit because I don't want to read the whole book to you. The entire circuit of the wall, which went around the outermost zone, they covered in a coating of brass. The circuit of the next wall they coated with tin, and the third, which encompassed the citadel, flashed with the red light of orichalcum. The palaces in the interior of the citadel were constructed in this wise. In the center was a holy temple dedicated to Clito and Poseidon, which remained inaccessible and was surrounded by an enclosure of gold. Granted, this isn't a one-to-one comparison, and maybe I'm reading a bit too much into things, but it certainly seems like Atlantis is meant to invoke a Persian-style state feel in the audience, at least in a Greek audience who would be familiar with these things. It's a place of powerful monarchs with no check on them. It is steeped in wealth and abundance, and it invokes feelings of fear, avarice, and a little bit of contempt in the Greeks. It also Like Persia, Atlantis is able to summon forth a vast army and navy, 10,000 war chariots, 120,000 heavy infantry, 180,000 light infantry armed with javelins, even more archers and slingers and skirmishers, and a fleet of ocean-going ships numbering 1,200 strong. With this army and navy, Atlantis had subdued Europe up to Italy and Africa right up to the border of Egypt and was eyeing the rest of the world until they ran into the properly virtuous state of ancient Athens, of course, whose small but rugged and well-trained soldiers would defeat the vast eastern western hordes of Atlantis and thus maintain the freedom of the Greek world. If this sounds like the narrative for the Battle of Marathon, well, Plato had written a lot about that battle as well. So I'm saying I don't think these similarities are accidental, my dear listeners. But let's talk about super virtuous Athens and its army of Captain Hellenes here. Athena and Hephaestus, being brother and sister and sharing many of the same interests and values, both Cook Attica as their district, and ordered the state much as Socrates said an ideal state should be ordered in the Republic. So it was such a state where people lived simply and strictly, ordered into professions, and not allowed luxuries. Critias notes that this ancient forgotten Athens had to master the spear and ordered its population into service based on their innate gifts and temperament, basically a caste system. In doing so, 20,000 men and women were separated out from society and devoted themselves entirely to the study of war and combat. They owned no property, had no families, and focused on their studies and training. Speaking as a Marine, I can hear the brass weeping at the idea of soldiers with no competing outside connections to get in the way of their training and deployment schedules. I mean, I've heard modern armed officers and NCOs announce that in a rational world, no one under the rank of staff sergeant or major would be allowed to get so much as engaged. But I'm wandering a bit and I apologize. Critias explains that in those days the lands of Attica were broader, richer, and more fertile, as repeated drownings in those cataclysms that just happened over and over again washed away much of the soil and left much of the land still underwater. So it's not just Atlantis that gets drowned here, it's everyone except Egypt. But this prehistoric Attica was more fertile, so feeding a 20,000 strong army that never did anything else was easy and not an economic strain at all. He also notes that this Athenian super army was made up of men and women, which is a radical notion even to many people today. The Athenians beat the Atlanteans through superior skill and leadership, freeing the known world, but it was wiped out in the same flood that destroyed Atlantis and many of the civilizations around it. The details of this cataclysm are honestly unknown because we only have a fragment of this work. Basically, we have the outline of the full story, which is given in the beginning, a really detailed description of Atlantis itself, and an announcement that their society had grown decadent and wicked, and Zeus was resolved to punish them, and then it cuts off. So we don't have anything after that. I should note that most of Plato's students, including Aristotle, thought Plato just made Atlantis up and considered it a morality tale. I did a lot of digging, and from what I can find, there were few, if any, Greek or Roman writers who disagreed with this or even thought that much of Atlantis. That said, keep in mind, we don't have the full body of Greek or Roman work. Much of what was written in those days has been lost. So we're not even sure how much we have as a percentage. As to people who do bring this up. There was Crantor, but claims that he went to Egypt and saw the column with the history of Atlantis written on it. It may actually be based on a mistranslation, so that's disputed. Ironically, for me, what we were supposed to focus on was the moral of super cool and super righteous Athens kicking the snot out of a large, powerful empire due to its superior social organization and morality. Because, again, this work is supposed to be a sequel to the Republic and showing us how Plato's ideal state would conduct itself in war and the effect it would have on the world around it. Now, everyone seems to just let that sail over their heads and got way more interested in Atlantis, with the exception of the Greeks and the Romans, who were actually there for this story. The Romans were actually vastly more interested in Troy. They wrote novels, for example, Dictys the Cretan's Chronicle of the Trojan War and Dares of Phaedra's History of the Destruction of Troy were two prose fiction novels, and there's of course the Aeneid by Virgil. So the Romans were like, yeah, this Atlantis thing is cool. Let's talk about Troy, which I find interesting because if you knew about this continent and you believed it was real and it's sunk under the sea, wouldn't you have more of an interest in it? Just throwing that out there as a thought. It's not until the medieval age where writers are operating off of fragments they have of Greek and Roman writings. Remember, at the time of the medieval age, they don't even have a full copy of the Iliad or the Odyssey. That doesn't come to Western Europe until after the Renaissance, basically. But those medieval writers would take Atlantis much more seriously, and as the Renaissance dawned and the age of exploration started, proving the world was much bigger than they imagined, writers like Sir Francis Bacon would take the understanding they had of the Atlantis story, which had been kind of passed to them via a game of telephone through Arab sources, stretching over thousands of years, hundreds of writers, dozens of languages and translators and storytellers, and they would try to pound this story into the real world or create their own versions of the story. And we're actually going to cover one of those next week. That said, we're going to stop here for this week. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if it wasn't informative, that it was at least entertaining. If so, please leave a like, comment, or even subscribe. All those really help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. If you'd like to support this channel, consider joining the ranks of my ever-wise patrons, whose votes decide content such as this video. You can vote for as little as $1 a month. There is a poll up there right now. Plus, patrons also get bonus videos, such as I mentioned the video on Plato's Republic. Speaking of patrons, I'd like to give a special thanks to Big Steve, my biggest patron supporter, who wrote a great pair of guest reviews last month. You can read those and over 7 years worth of book reviews at the link below. There's also a link to the video on Solon, the Athenian that Plato claimed received the story in the first place. Join me next week for Sir Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, and until then, take care of yourselves, each other, and as always, keep reading.